Welcome back to the Line Podcast. My name is Aaron Alexander. This is a place that we bring together the world's leading exports. They are not goods, they are human beings. World's leading experts in all things health and wellness to help you optimizing your mind and your body and your movement. And this conversation was with my dear friend, Michael Trainer. Michael is a pretty brilliant human being. He has much experience in the shamanic worlds and the various different healing practices around the world. He is the co-founder of Global Citizen, which is a foundation and event, musical event, fundraising event, which who knows when the heck one of those will happen again. That brings together millions of people and millions of dollars and all sorts of A-list celebrities, the Jay-Z's and Beyoncé's of the world come together to help support Earth and the people amongst it. So really valuable conversation. We get into many of the indigenous practices that Michael has stumbled across over the years, a lot of mind-body stuff, really fabulous conversation. I know you guys will absolutely devour it. The quote that I have for the day, this comes from a book that I was reading called, I think it's called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, I'm pretty sure. And I have a few that I wrote down actually that I find relevant, especially presently. First one that I found to be pretty fantastic goes like this: he who knows how to suffer suffers less. We typically multiply our suffering by adding layers of fear and worry. So learning how to effectively suffer is one of those things that you can't really read about. You just need to do hard things with regularity. So you start to build up some degree of stress inoculation. Be a fancy way of saying exposure therapy, which is another fancy way of saying doing hard crap and being able to essentially like work out your attitude on the way that hard crap makes you feel. Just like lifting weights in a gym, you can train your attitude and your perception and the filter in which you take things on. Some other stuff that I wrote down. I just have notes in my cellular telephone, parts that I thought were interesting. Stress inoculation, building yourself up to stressors through exposure. Got to do it. Next thing I wrote down, this is all jarbled up in here, so hopefully these are successful. This is kind of a good one, I think. Ambition is a constipated expression of human longing. Woo! Ambition is a constipated expression of human longing. My buddy who's been on here multiple times, I've also been on his podcast, Dr. Christopher Ryan. He recently had a book come out called Civilized Death, another book called Sex at Dawn. He was one of the first people that turned me onto the idea of being suspicious of ambition. I'm suspicious of my own ambition. I've been going through somewhat of a lull of sorts. Chelsea, the person that puts together this podcast for me, she is listening right now, and she knows that I am a pain in the ass to work with because I've been kind of, I think questioning my own ambition and what that ends up expressing itself out to be is me not wanting to do a lot other than hiking and surfing and reflecting on thoughts of traveling around the world, which is pretty big pain in the butt to work with that type of person. Let me tell you something. I think that's enough. That is fine. But it is an interesting idea to question if you do have much ambition, which if you're listening to this, there's a good chance you do. Where does that come from? Does that come from a purely healthy, whole place? Do you feel content? Do you feel loved? Even if you don't have some degree of monetary success or you don't bring some trophy back, is it possible to be ambitious while also maintaining a root of feeling content, as opposed to living your whole life or a good chunk of your life in this looming sensation of discontentment and then not realizing that you've had that your sphincters clenched up for the last 70 years, and then you're on your deathbed and you're like, oh man, I can finally relax. Can we crack that puzzle a little sooner? I'm in process with it. We'll see. But be suspicious of ambition. It's very interesting. thank you guys so much for tuning in to the website, alignpodcast.com, alignpodcast.com. If you have interest in learning how to reverse forward head posture, for starters. If your head is jutting forward, your shoulders are rolling forward, it's upper crossed syndrome is a fancy term for that. Your shoulder blades start to disengage, the muscles in and around those guys, lower traps, mid-trap, rhomboids, all that stuff, and then the muscles in and around the neck get all tensed up in the back of the neck. Then there's a reverse pattern in the front of the body. That pattern is a bummer for the structure of your whole entire system, pulls your whole thing out of whack, and that's one of the things we get into on alignpodcast.com, the first week of the Align Method online program, which is free, and it is right on there, and you'll have a good time with it. So I hope you guys devour that thing. It's good for you, and people have been really loving it. So I appreciate you checking that out. Alignpodcast.com, Align Method, first week, no charge, just enjoy. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Back to the podcast with my homeboy, Michael Trainer.
So basically, I've been thinking about, you and I have talked about this, is this idea of, okay, I feel like a lot of people go about relationships in a transactional way. It's sort of still quid pro quo. Many of the systems I think that people live out of are still relics of, 20th century industrial capitalism.
Yep.
So the question is like, well, how do you live effectively in the 21st century? I mean, you talk about that profoundly in the context of movement, but I think what isn't often talked about, which is an area of deep interest to me, is relationally. Like how, like in Sri Lanka, there's no word for privacy. There's no word for possession traditionally. So you exist in relationship to the whole. So alignment there isn't even of course there's the physical element, but alignment in the context of Sri Lanka is actually about orientation of the entire whole, which is the group, the collective, right? So it's sort of analogous to what Chris Ryan talks about, where it's that notion of, the traditional or pastoral, like the ancestral way of living was very much oriented around the collective, right? In Bali, when a child was born, it was passed from every lactating mother so that it would feel that the mother was in the whole, right? So I think that there's this very interesting dynamic which we're seeing, unfortunately, the dis-ease pop up in our culture, which is this fallacy of individuality and like the city on the hill, like I am, strong, I'm basically an island unto myself, which no one's an island unto themselves. So basically, a lot of what's becoming, it has been interest to me for a very long time, but is resurging in its interest, is this idea of like, how could I explore these ancient techniques, technologies, worldviews in a way and translate it for the modern mind?
I was talking I love all that. I was just talking to, do you know Daniele Bolelli?
I don't.
He's great. He's a sweetie. He does a podcast called History on Fire, and he's a historian and like philosopher, and writes books about martial arts and philosophy and all that stuff. He's great. But we were talking yesterday, and just in relation to like how it's interesting how addicted so many people are to social media, and it's like Alan Watts talks about how we're eating the menu instead of the food, and we get this image of pretty girl's face, and she's smiling, and she's in a waterfall, and you see that on your screen, you have this dopamine release, this whole thing. And I think it's interesting that we're in kind of this almost vulnerable position because we are so autonomous and living in our nuclear islands inside of our apartments or what have you, and then we inherently do love connection because I think that connection actually feeds us. It's like this tuning mechanism. So we're in this island, and then all of a sudden we have access to the internet, which opens that up, and it's like, it removes that veil of privacy.
Totally.
But it's the menu instead of the actual real thing.
100%. So
now it's like, what does that do?
Well, we don't even know, right? We don't really fully know, but we're starting to see some of the downstream consequences, right? Where it's like, symptoms, right? Just like we don't necessarily probably know the root of the dis-ease, yet we can start to see some of the symptoms in the form of like, deep depression, loneliness, which is catalyzed by people seeing only everyone else's highlight reels. Like, I'm grateful that I personally didn't grow up in like the awkward adolescent years besieged by everyone else's Instagram and Facebook and like, all of the context of that constructed reality. Because
what were you besieged by in that time? Because that's always my question. I wonder that when I'm in my car and I reach out for my phone, I have this like, my hand just feels like it's possessed and is like reaching down to the console to grab the phone.
Yeah.
And I'm like, was there just something else?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was mixtapes. Okay. I mean, like, I'm a little bit older than you, so I mean, like, for me, it was mixtapes, which I actually missed. Now, talk about the Instagram. See, this is the cool thing. Like, back then, when you had a crush, right? You weren't like looking at their Instagram profile. You'd just be like thinking about like, I mean, I don't know. I was in middle school, so like, like gym class kickball game, and you're like, man, she's amazing. I'm gonna make her the dopest mixtape ever. And I just remember like I would like be in my room and I'd have like this ancient like 1980s hi-fi system, and I'd listen to like WGCI, which was the hip hop station, because I went to public school and like that was what I listened to. And then literally you try to pause right in time to catch the song, and then hit the pause right after it ends. So I just remember like, exercising in my feeble 12-year-old ways, trying to like bulk up, do all the things, and like hit pause right at the right time. But I made some really good mixtapes, to be honest. Like that was my thing, But and then you'd actually, just like you'd go about like the notes, like you'd write on the back, it'd be like the whole like hooks, like fade in, fade outs of the different songs. I actually to this day wish that I still had those mixtapes, because that like almost as much as a journal, it's like, man, it was those are like, that's the best thing to have in a time capsule. Like if you were to go back in your own mind, oh man, yeah, I made some epic mixtapes.
But do you think there was the same level of like possession of the mixtapes? Not possession to own, but to like a I don't know, a spirit possessing you. It feels almost like social media.
No, it didn't have that same vibe, right? It was like, I think to me at least, there was like a create it and then let it go. And like it wasn't like whereas I feel like with social media, all of us are like participating in this grand experiment of like digital identity construction.
Fuck yeah.
Individually and collectively, that has downstream consequences we don't even know about, right? Like I have no idea how my post, which I may have total intention around being uplifting, inspirational, maybe triggering for someone else, right? Like it's like, because everyone receives things, it's like Don Miguel Ruiz. It's like everyone receives things from their own dream, right? Their own construct. So I've definitely had moments where I've been in darker places and like it looks like everyone else on the planet is having this epic experience except me. Totally. And I know that other people have that same experience. And so I think, the challenges with this, they're nuanced, but the challenges with, I think, this technological age is it's like, okay, that feeling of loneliness, which I think is in part also, I'm gonna actually take this somewhere else, which is, I think traditionally, if we were to go to, sort of ancient, let's go beyond the mixtape, or let's go deep, like ancestral again, like that Sri Lankan aspect of tribal living.
Yeah.
In that context, there was also a constructed reality and that constructed reality kept that inflating of ego down at bay, right? Like so Chris Ryan, mutual friend of ours, writes in his book Civilized to Death about like the hunt, and hunters would go out, and even if you were the most amazing hunter, you would take an arrow from maybe an elder that was still back at camp. And if you, for example, got the kill for the meat that fed the entire community, and by the way, you didn't go off and like hoard that meat, right? That meat was for everyone. You would be kind of taken the piss out of by other hunters like me. We'd give you a hard time. Why? To keep your ego in check, keep you level, right? Yeah. And the credit would go to the elder whose arrow you used, because so all of those mechanisms existed to keep about this sort of sense of the interdependence and interworkings of the community. And now, I think, as evidenced by technology, like we are so far from that worldview and so much about this like puff the chest, me, mine, look at me, look how good, that it's like, it's led to this societal disease, right? Which we're seeing manifest in a variety of forms, I think like everything from, and I don't want to grossly simplify, but like some of the mass shootings, I would imagine some of those are just like deeply lost souls who haven't, we don't have the processes of individuation, right? There's no graduation from unindividuated boyhood into manhood. Like I've seen processes of individuation. I had my own in the form of my dad taking me through something called the Mankind Project, which was a modern approximation. It's called the Mankind Project.
Okay.
It exists out there today. But it was powerful for me. I had a very unique experience where in my dark night of the soul, I moved out across the country with my girlfriend at the time. She cheated on me, and I knew no one. I also used to perform capoeira. I happened to have blown my knee out at the very same time, so I didn't have my, way of moving and expressing myself. I didn't have my community. I knew no one, and I moved across the country. And my girlfriend cheated on me. So it was like, not to be in a victim mindset. I was just in a dark place. I was like drinking beers. I was doing all the things that were sort of like taking me further down the darkness. And my dad was like, which is why I have part of the reason I have such a strong relationship with him. He was like, he had gone through this process of individuation with these other men in the 80s, and he's like, I'm flying out and I'm going to staff your weekend. Get ready. And I basically went through this rite of passage that was super fucking intense. Like, it was like definitively confronting and shedding the sort of adolescence and stepping into manhood, which I then did a integration group every week for 4 years with that same group of men. Like, we would meet every week and do deep work. But most people have no access to that, right? Like, most people, and we see it at the highest levels, unindividuated masculinity, like boyhood. There's a book called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover that I highly recommend to people. Also, obviously, a lot of people know David Data's work, but this archetype of the mature masculine, one of the aspects of the unindividuated masculine is what they call the armchair tyrant. And without naming names, I think we see a lot of that armchair tyrant even in the highest levels of leadership in our own country, where it's like, if someone hasn't been moved into and graduated into that sense of the true masculine, which is really a stand, like the traditional warrior creed wasn't about like, let's go off and kill people. It was like, I am a stand and willing to sacrifice myself. Today's a good day to die, right? Like,
yeah, hope ahead.
Exactly. I am willing to sacrifice myself each day for that which is the bigger, like the greatness, right? My community, the great spirit, whatever it is, I'm willing to sacrifice myself. That is what this vessel is for.
And inherently, when you're in that space, it means that the other members of the tribe are there for you as well, which it's not just a one-way street.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think lots of people, I mean, I've thought about this recently, and I'm not proud. Like, I was like, man, if you really think about it, part of the reason I moved from New York was I thought to myself, if shit hit the fan, like, who'd really have my back? Yeah. I have tons of friends, like tons of quote-unquote friends, and they're good people. I'm not saying that in a negative sense, but like, when it comes down to the, like, if you, God forbid, were in a hospital, who would actually show up every day? Like, for me, that's a very small number of people when I got really real with myself. And I think that's the other piece, right? Is like, I think in traditional, societies and cultures, there was a mechanism, the entire structure of the society was built around that. And when you did go through frail, weak phases, which I'm directly confronting, for example, with my dad at the moment, there was a mechanism by which people would support that, right? Like, whole structures, existed socially to revere the elder, and also to acknowledge that there's a cycle to life, and also embrace death, not as like, in the sort of Stoic sense, right? Like, as an impetus for living, as opposed to like something we don't even talk about, Yeah. So I think all those aspects, I think, we've largely lost in this digital age, and I think there's gonna be a reckoning coming. Not to say that we're gonna lose technology. I think technology is gonna keep going, and I think there are aspects in which technology is amazing. I'm not like a hater of technology. I love the fact that I could call Sri Lanka right now if I so chose.
Yeah.
And so it can be profound for connection, but I do think that there's going to be a necessity to really get back into these ancient, as you see sort of in the nutrition sense, like the paleo movement. I think there's like a whole mindset orientation as it relates to paleo, if you will, or ancient ways of being and thinking and doing, that I think we need to revivify if we stand a chance. Terrence McKenna calls it the Gaian mind, and I think the main thing none of us want to even think about is the fact that we're basically amidst a mass extinction, and if we don't wake up to ourselves, we will no longer exist. I mean, the Earth will continue on, whether we as humans continue on.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder, because we can get inevitably we can get and are so wrapped up in our own filter and perspective of the world, you know, and it's like we all live in our echo chambers, and now the algorithms of the internet make it even more echo chambery because they're literally listening to you.
Totally.
I had a Siri at my house, and she's like, "Oh, cool, you're talking about the black thing." Like, all right, check your mail.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, and it's I had an interesting idea that I was excited about with that, but I don't know where I was going exactly. You might have something interesting to say about that in general.
Well, no, I mean, I think that Siri, that'll take us into a whole different tangent. But the fact that our phones are listening to us,
yeah, they're listening to us
for 100%. I mean, without question.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, so in relation to, there was another idea that I got excited about, the fact that Siri's.
We were talking about Guy in Mind a bit, and then that was a catalyst for your thinking around Siri.
Yeah.
And I don't know where you were going.
It doesn't matter. But so like what kind of ancient, what did you call it? Ancient principles for a modern world?
Yeah, ancient principles for modern living. I mean, so it's really the concept I've been thinking about the most lately. And
I have my idea.
Okay, go. Yeah, bring it. No, don't go for it.
Thank you. Sorry, I got because that's so crazy that Siri's listening and she's like selling us stuff.
Yeah, totally.
But so I'm
gonna go on my phone after this, and it's gonna be like, you know, like I don't even know, like bell tents and like exactly. You know, like all the things.
You know, so it's interesting how we have this perspective of like the world is coming to an end and everything's collapsing and we're all isolated, lonely, and anxious and depressed and like You know, and sometimes I question if perhaps like Earth, Gaia, whatever, the grander organism, for some reason really wanted the human species to create a bunch of trash and plastic. You know, or maybe like what is like the grand design to this?
Yes.
You know, like I don't think that's the reason to just like throw your hands up in the air and just say, okay, fuck it, like let's just, you know, destroy the whole thing. But I wonder if perhaps there's some other lens or filter of what this destruction is, and if we did pull out, you know, from like the 30,000 foot view, if perhaps it's like, you know what, all this terrible destruction that we're doing, like maybe there is some grand design to it.
Well, I've thought about this a fair amount, and I think there's something interesting. There's a mathematical cosmologist that I love named Brian Swim. And he talks about this concept to a degree. So I did like this deep like permaculture workshop, and like you're at the end you're like, should I even have children, because what's like the magnitude of the trash that will be, you know. But what came to me was, you know, what I love about the way he talks is so there's the micro, right, of like the trash and the plastic and all the things, which are super important. But then if you go macro, he's like, all right, well, what's amazing is we live in this incredible dynamic tension. And I would describe the challenge we face as commensurate with that tension. And what he meant by that is to say, like, the Earth exists within this like infinitesimally small band between the sun and the planetary system, such that it's allowed life to flourish as we know it. Like, that's a super small band. And that's not just true of the solar system, but the solar system, like, within the universe within the multitude of universes. Like, we're in this like very unique band. And it's enabled the flourishing of life as we know it. And you take that into a micro scale, like talk about like the rabbit and the hawk. The rabbit and the hawk have each evolved to be exactly what they are, like existentially and physically, biologically, because of the predator-prey relationship that they have, right? The hare has evolved to be, you know, adroit and fast and able to, like, you know, move. And the hawk's evolved its eyesight in part to be able to continue that cycle of life, which is integral, right? So my thinking is, whether right or wrong, I don't know, that with any commensurate challenge, just as in the sort of predator-prey, there will be a commensurate evolution of consciousness that provides the antidote necessary to bring things back into balance. Yeah. So amidst the plastic, amidst the shit, I think there's still the possibility for us to, you know, tune in if we get it right, to find the solutions, to figure out how we actually play on this spaceship, you know, we call planet Earth, in a way that doesn't tear it apart. But I think we're at a real critical point, and the challenge is with all the noise, right? I would say that's tuning into signal. I think we're so besieged by noise, aka social media and all the things that keep us like this, that I think the great question is, can we pull ourselves back from the noise well enough and collectively such that we can hear the signal. Because I do think that it's my belief that there is, with any challenge, there's a commensurate opportunity for figuring itself out. Because I think the guy in mind wants. I do believe challenges are part of the equation, but I also think that there is the antidotal context of evolution that will enable that balancing. Because I think the Earth exists as a balancing entity, right? Like it's all about putting itself back into homeostasis, into balance. Now, we're definitely not at balance right now. I think that the possibilities exist for us if we band together to bring it back to balance, but I'd say at the moment it's not looking fantastic, you know? So the question is, does humanity make it? I don't know. But I think it'd be, you know, I want to fight for us, hopefully, you know, figuring out a way to do it in the small way that I can.
Yeah.
Because I mean, plastic, and it exists as it does. So I think there's a bigger philosophical piece, right? Like, would anything sort of evolve, and then you get micro at this, and then you think about atrocities, and it's like, well, I mean, I don't know what the justification for those are. I don't know why they exist. I'm not going to pretend to posit that I do know.
Well, like the atrocities of, like, you know, a man lighting himself on fire at a protest or something like that. It's like, if you look at that at a microscopic level, it's like, well, that was terrible, you know. But then if you pull it back, you're like, well, the meaning of that moment actually ended up creating this catalyst that created global change. So if we're at the man burning in the moment, it's like, oh my God, like, we have really fucked up.
Yeah.
You know, but
it wakes you up.
It wakes you up. So I think that it's like the people that say that, you know, the boy that decides that he needs to bring a weapon to school and, you know, prove a point that he's a man, or, you know, whatever his reasoning behind that is, to get to that point of wanting to do that. I think there's a lot of traumas that have been covered and pushed under the rug and pushed under the rug and pushed under the rug and pushed under the rug. You know, and it's like we have resistance to having trauma in any instance, but in fact, those little micro traumas regularly throughout allow us to kind of decompress and not have that one huge, explosive, devastating macro trauma.
But if you don't have the micro traumas reckoned with, I mean, I think that what you bring is a really interesting point, right? Like, so you first talk about, like, the self-immolation of lighting one on fire. And that, at least the reference I think of, is like Vietnam era monk. And that is like a super conscious choice of a person, granted, inflicting ultimate existential ending to themselves. Then you brought up this point of, like, these young men coming into school and this notion of micro traumas. And what's interesting is, you know, I think there's so many traumas happening now at such a pace, right? Like, again, sort of bring Terrence McKenna back. He talks about the world is evolving now at such an exponential rate, right? Like, so, like, you know, and forgive me if I butcher the quote, but he's like, since 1995, the world has changed more than it did in the previous 1,000 years, you know, like, and so I think when you think about how that affects the human vehicle and this delicate thing we call the psyche within that vehicle, and you focus a tremendous amount, obviously, on the physicality, which is so integral, and we often forget. And I think it's a central conversation. But psychologically, so many people are besieged with all these traumas, and, like, there's no operating manual for modern day living, and there's no tribe to hold you, to guide you now. And so that's what's crazy, is you put these people in. Many of them suffer abuses, or, you know, and I'm not like justifying in any way, shape, or form these actions, but many people are besieged by these traumas, and they have nothing to shepherd them through those micro traumas. So those micro traumas oftentimes compound on each other, because oftentimes we have this culture of, like, I'm going to get you, like, competitive, like, get up, back and forth until it gets bigger and bigger, and it escalates, and then it explodes, right? Yeah. And if you don't find a way to, for lack of a better analogy, turn that into sort of spiritual compost, right? Take the shit in your life and actually transmute it into, like, seeing some of those challenges as obstacles to transcend, which is what a rite of passage was, right? Traditionally, when a boy was seen as, like, fucking ready for manhood, they would go through an arduous journey.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like like a video game. It was some real shit. It was like in the Amazon. There's a tribe where it's like, okay, I see you flirting with that little girl, right? Who's now entering puberty. Like you continue on that boyhood way, all of a sudden you're gonna be starting to pop out babies, and like you're 13 years old. Like time for the men to take you on like a little bit of a trip, and existentially confront death, right? Like they would use fire ants, like excruciating pain. But then on the opposite side of that, one would see the role they played, and they would be embraced in the culture and the society in a way where they were seen, they were recognized. And I think so many people don't have that benefit, right? Like they're just lost. They don't feel seen, they don't feel a sense of purpose, they're not held, there's no one that really has their back. And compound that on like multiple levels of trauma, it's not a recipe for, I think, a healthy articulation of humanity.
Yeah.
So
So what do you think? So I have experienced tangible moments. I've ended up, I think, kind of aimlessly seeking out various different forms of rites of passage ever since trying to beer bong a 40 in front of
totally,
30 people in a basement when I was 15 to getting into rock climbing and almost killing myself, and getting into surfing and being in waves where I'm like, oh, I really don't belong here. Like, this is a bad decision.
Yeah, totally.
Not for me.
I've been there too in the surf. Yeah, it's like, if people ask me if I surf, I'm like, well, not well.
Yeah. and then to psychedelics, which has been, I think, one of the more. I mean, all of those. Honestly, each one of those was learned in different ways. But I've had post, particularly like, well, whatever, fill in the blank, like ayahuasca, psilocybin. Both of those have been getting to the other side of that experience, where during there was lots of fear, and lots of like, oh my God, I don't know if I'll ever be the same, and I don't know if I'm ever going to come back from this, and I don't know, like all these different things. And then you get to the other side, and there's this like deep sensation of gratitude's not the word I'm looking for, but progress isn't either. But just like it's like a sensation of like a rite of passage of some sort, like it's the closest thing that I've experienced in my life of like, oh, like I feel like I've kind of like I've like walked through the fire in a way, and it came to the other side, and like, okay, like how do I address life now that I've actually been exposed myself to that fire?
Totally.
One, what happens if a person, and I still feel like I'm attached to a lot of boy stuff. Like I don't think I've fully come through a rite of passage. I think my book has been actually one of the other kind of arduous journeys of sorts. That I'm starting to feel a little bit more in myself.
Totally.
Post book, which is interesting. But so, how does one navigate rite of passage in a modern world? And if one does not, what are the effects, and does it matter at all?
Yeah, I mean, huge question. For me, it's one of the central questions of our time. And so there's so many different articulations of rite of passage, but because you mentioned, for example, psychedelics, I'll approach that first. I think because we don't have a tremendous number of healthy containers or this sort of tribal worldview, for me, without going to great narrative, I had deep traumas when I was young. So I was jumped by a gang, my first experience alone abroad. I got jumped by like 30 guys.
30.
Yeah, so I was like, I associated, well, not all at the same time.
How many people actually had a hand on you?
Oh, I mean, like probably like 7 or 8, and then fortunately it got broken up. But so what happened is psychologically, I started to associate going away from the nest solo, and I love traveling. I grew up with a passion for traveling, but that was my first. I was 12. That was my first experience alone abroad. I associated travel with trauma. So for me, the rite of passage, one of my first initial rites of passage, which is what led me to Sri Lanka, was facing that. So I developed what they call an obsessive compulsive personality, and the prescription was Prozac and psychotherapy. But basically, I was like, okay, if you're in an acute level of depression, I think that makes sense. But for me, I was like, I had enough wherewithal where I like could step back, and I was like, all right, I'm about to step into an area of extreme discomfort. Because when I have stepped away from the home and the sanctity of the home, I've had very traumatic experiences, like actually traumatic experiences. So I associate leaving the nest with trauma. Now, in traditional cultures, when someone faced trauma or was looking at how they could, be in the world, they had a community and a worldview in which to assuage that anxiety through rituals and community. And I just didn't have that. So I was creating rituals on my own, obsessive compulsive rituals like checking the stove, etc. Right. But basically I was like, okay, I'm just doing what people have been doing since time immemorial. I'm ritualizing my behavior. It just doesn't exist within the traditional socio-religiosity that would have existed sort of thousands of years ago.
Wow.
So to me, I was like, all right, I'm going to go as deep into my fear as possible. I'm going to go to the other side of the world, which was Sri Lanka, from where I grew up in Chicago, and confront that fear. And that's actually where I met this traditional Ayurvedic shaman, and he was a 7th-generation healer. He didn't have a son, so he invited me in, and I had this profound experience. That's a whole deep narrative, but I think what that led me to was, one, I was able to transcend those great fears.
What was the deep experience? Can you get into it?
Oh yeah, sure. So I mean, I went to a country amid civil war. So literally on every corner in Sri Lanka, there was a guy in like a medicine, like behind sandbags with like M60s, and so I was in this paradox of this Buddhist culture amidst civil war, which was like I don't know how to describe it, but it was a profound mirror based on what I was reckoning with, because I had this inner peace, but also this sort of turmoil.
What year is this?
I was 19 years old. So this was 23 years ago.
Okay.
And so in that worldview, what I studied was ostensibly this form of Ayurvedic shamanism called Bhuta, which is one of the 8 branches of Ayurveda, and it's about the occult. So it's basically an exorcistic rite. So when someone fell out of balance, or also into their own version of disease, right? In our culture, if someone's out of balance, they may be called schizophrenic and institutionalized. In a traditional society, perhaps, I'm not going to say definitively, a schizophrenic might be an ideal shaman, right? And now shamans, like, you're in Venice, people call themselves a shaman. It's like, that wasn't a sexy thing.
Great way to pick up chicks.
Yeah, exactly.
It's my move.
That's that. Erewhon.
$24
It's
salad.
It's my great.
Wear a shirt like I'm wearing right now. Convince a girl I'm a shaman.
It's my greatest pet peeve. But anyway, well, that's a story for another time. So I mean, I think we have this thing of like people are yearning after this, but like traditionally a shaman was not a sexy exotic thing. It was like you agreed to live outside of society, to basically shepherd your community forward by being an intermediary between this world and the next, right? The spirit world and this world. So when you talk about things like psychedelics, the rituals I studied did not use entheogenic medicines, but did use things like dance and music to induce trance. And it was sort of a cosmological recreation of everyone's shared worldview from sunset to sunrise, which is also traditionally how many psychedelics would have been administered in traditional contexts. But I do think in the context of, for those who are seeking that rite of passage, I mean, I think things like the Mankind Project for Men is really a profound vehicle. I do think there are few vehicles when used, what I would say ethically, and this obviously is my own definition, but ethically and intentionally, I think very few things have the potential impact of psychedelics when held in an intentional container. I think the challenge with it is, I think a lot of people are like, again, with that Western mind, they think of like a psychedelic as a drug, and like they just want the ecstasies. They want to get out of their mind, but they're not using it intentionally. And I think, as you know, having done some journeys yourself, it's like if it's actually held, and I've had the good fortune of sitting, for example, with like the Huayca in Mexico around peyote, and with some very profound shamans in Brazil around ayahuasca. And it's not something I've talked about a tremendous amount publicly, but has it been absolutely profound for me in terms of my own evolution of consciousness and rebalancing? Absolutely. Is it a way in which to, I think, tap into and beyond that sort of default construct of consciousness that we often get trapped in, right? Like the thing that we wake up identifying with, aka our ego mind, because that every day we tell ourselves the same stories. Yes, it's a massive reset and transcendence of our default mode network, right? Which they talk about cognitively. Yeah. And there's very few things that can do that. I mean, I've been a meditator for 23 years, and I think there's very few tools that are as profound. But I also think with modern day life and living, when you have people that have experienced acute traumas, I think meditation, for example, and other forms and modalities are integral to maintaining that balance. A lot of the movement practices you talk about, walks, etc. But if you have situations of extreme PTSD, very few things are demonstrating the efficacy that, say, for example, a well-administered, well-held psychedelic ceremony can do. But I think the key distinction, which I think often isn't spoken about, is, to me, when you talk about plant medicines, and I think plant medicines do in the Terence McKenna sense, bring us back into that Gaian mind, bring us back into that ancestral worldview, that way of being that is beyond our egoic minds. A lot of it is about set and setting and intention, and then also who's holding that container, right? So some people are going off to like a rave and taking these things, and to me that's like you're opening yourself, or like going to some cat who went to Peru and is at Erewhon for a week and is like, dude, I'll serve you, you know, like that's actually to be super dangerous, because it's like they don't know what they're dealing with. And you know, depending on your beliefs or not, I actually do believe that there is a spiritual element and dimensionality to this life and to this world, which we unfortunately, I think, have not been shepherded forward in terms of the reverence and respect. But traditionally, you know, like there's so many things that go on behind the scenes. For example, offerings, you know, there's spiritual payments that are made by these actual shamans that enable them to hold the space for you to do the deep work. And
what does spiritual payment mean?
Spiritual payments and offering. So, for example, I'll just give a cogent example for those listening. So, for example, like in like a traditional Huarica peyote ceremony, Huarica is a tradition in Mexico. Even for someone to be able to serve peyote, oftentimes, for example, if that person's a single person, that's like they're taking a vow, and we're talking a multi-year vow, for example, of abstaining from sexuality. If they're in a partnership, they're committing to only be with that partner.
Wow.
When you do a ceremony, you're cleansing all of your sins. You're cutting cords from all of your previous partners, because there's a belief that when you align with someone sexually, you're aligning chakras and you're taking on their energy, and they can cord you and you can cord them. So you're cutting those cords with love and reverence, and you're offering that to the sacred fire. You know, you're basically cleansing yourself of some of these various acts in a way that liberates both yourself and the other from that energetic attachment. You're also making offerings to the sacred fire, to the sacred waters, to the earth, to that great Gaian aspect of life that many of us take for granted, right? And so so basically the act in and of itself of the ceremony is an act of offering, like in its true essence, as I understand it, with my own limited view, you know, but having studied it. So there's this orientation around, you know, also that depth is commensurate with the intentionality, right? Like the commitment of, for example, a gentleman, Banky, who's this beautiful Brazilian shaman, he's planted over 2 million trees in and of himself. And he will go diet for 6 months at a time in the forest by himself, right? So like he's literally, there's an ability, and part of the medicine comes from commensurate with that offering, that sacrament, that dedication that's coming from someone who's lived in relationship and committed themselves to the medicine for years of their lives. And so in the context of ceremony, which can be a profound rite of passage, you know, I think with the Western mind, we often think, oh, okay, I'm just taking this exogenous substance that will cause me to quote unquote trip, and then, you know, I'll have these revelations. In my particular view, it's actually way deeper than that. It's not a drug. You're taking a whole plant, in this context, a master plant, which happens to probably have played a very significant role in even the evolution of the human entity and consciousness in and of itself. I mean, there are people who postulate that. Terence McKenna calls it the Stone Age theory. Yeah, exactly. Whether that's true or not, I still believe you can see, whether it be you wanted to look at Wachuma, you want to look at peyote, ayahuasca, there's physical evidence that we know about that dates back 3-6 thousands of years. I mean, like we're talking a very ancient form of tradition that's only been codified as a quote-unquote drug in the last 50 years in places, 50 to 70 years, which was obviously attached to politics as well. And there is something dangerous when you're talking about a default mode of consciousness and network, that the free thinking and tapping into the Gaian mind can be a massive disruption to the default way of being, right? So I do think, to the rite of passage context, I think a well-held ceremony, and the medicine is not just the physical sacrament, but who's holding the space, the commitments they've made, how they've prayed over, in my view, the preparation of that medicine, you know, where it was sourced. I mean, even, for example, this is wild, but like even like a Wachuma cactus, every Wachuma is different, right? Based on the soil it's grown in, based on the amount of sun, based on the intention. So like there's whole levels at which like we don't fully like comprehend the nuance of the medicine. And then who are you? You're entering into the field, right? You're entering into that collective consciousness. Who are you sitting with? You know, because you can do their work and they can do your like it. You're entering. So having that be a well-contained space, and then in my particular worldview, also like if it isn't being held with integrity, and there are some, just as there are yoga teachers that may not have the best intentions, there are, not everyone has the best, if it's a safe space that allows the depth at which you can explore and prevents some of the negative forces, I think both in terms of, other humans and also energetics to be held at bay such that someone can have the true trust to be able to delve deeply into themselves. That plus, and I think here's where the real work comes in, integration, which very few people talk about, right? Like that can be a rite of passage, but any ecstasies, which have been used for thousands of years as a mechanism for transcendence, needs to, in my view, to be integrated. And that's why I said when I did that men's work, which involved no entheogenic plants, that was strictly just like hard emotional rite of passage, and beautiful, beautiful work. But the sea change came not from that weekend, which was profound and beautiful, but actually from the 4 years of week in, week out committing to show up and support other men in this way of like, I'm going to show you my darkness, my shadow, my light, and I'm going to hold you and see you and love you and fucking shepherd you through regardless. No matter what comes up, I've got your back, Yeah. That integration for me led to a sea change from dark night of the soul to like, moving to New York, grad school, professional context evolution, all the things. But it was like 4 years, So I think, to me, there are different mechanisms. I think plant medicines can be a profound vehicle, and I think given my particular views, given how fast things are moving, I think they're one of the ways that can be the most disruptive. But I just think the nature of the container is so critical and so infrequently talked about in terms of who's serving the medicine and how it's held and the integrity of that vehicle. But in a well-held vehicle with the proper integration, I think there's very few ancient technologies that compare to a great plant medicine in terms of the power to disrupt the default mode network and have an impetus in totally changing the way that you go about living your life. I'm guessing we haven't talked deeply about it, but I'm guessing that's been the case for you. It's for sure been the case for me. I'm like, all right, like changed my professional course, changed even how I go about dating and what I'm looking for in terms of relationships. Like it's been like a total shift. I mean, I still have work I'm doing, no question about it. But for example, right now I'm not drinking, right? Like I'm not saying I'll never have a drink again, but I just realized I had done ceremony and then I went, it was my birthday and I was on a boat in Ibiza and I was like, oh yeah, of course I'll have some rosé, like let's do it. And it was like, I just worked my ass off, like gone through the trials and tribulations, true rite of passage, felt of the best I've ever felt in my life. And literally one sip of alcohol, not that it was like bad or I was hungover, but it was like, I could tell that I was like numbing myself, Yeah. And I'm not making it, anyone who is out there who's drinking bad, anything like that. I just recognized it myself. I was like, well, shit, that's probably not serving me. And like, as I'm trying to do exactly what you just did, right, which is write a book and think about like things that require long-term focus and commitment, and I'm battling through other things like Lyme exposure and now mold, it's like, okay, well, the deck's already like, I gotta shuffle for a new hand, and things like alcohol and whatnot probably aren't going to serve me as I move through this phase. So, but that commitment and that insight came to me because of, for example, those plants, right? Where I was like, that's like, I've been sipping at the most sacred of waters, and like, I'm going to go back to like McDonald's to eat, like, and that's what like, but to me, alcohol is like the McDonald's of mind-altering substances. It's like, it's like, no, that's again, not to make it wrong. I was just like, it's not my thing. If I'm actually committed to, which is what I saw, which is what I've seen sort of in my own work, whether it be medicine work or meditation or some of these other journeys, it's like, okay, it just shows you where you are and where you can be. But I think to bring it full circle, I think if we look at our lives also as sacred offerings, which I think is the other tenet, which is one of the things I want to talk about in this book, I think, life rises up to us to the degree that we're willing to offer ourselves, and I think we can live our life as an offering. And to me, that's really what I'm wanting to commit more towards, is like, okay, how can I live my life as an offering? Because so much of the things that I think I desperately want, that I've been going about in a certain way, whether that's like a true love partnership, and I'm like, well, okay, well, I'll just law of average, like if I date, at some point I'll meet that person, whereas like I know intellectually, but it's not what I actually want to contend with. Where now I'm like, and you and I have talked about this, it's like, we're relatively, young guys, we could probably like have a multitude of potential experiences. I'm now to the point where I'm like, man, like I'm sacrificing true fulfillment for fun. Like I'm actually choosing fun time and again, and sometimes it's not even fun, like. And what's at stake? Well, for me, and I'm probably about a decade older than you, but for me, what's at stake is like I'm looking at it and I'm like, man, like I know in myself I want to have a family. Yeah. So what's at stake is like, I'm not saying that like life's gonna like golden tunnel once I have a family, but I'm recognizing in myself that like I'm actually choosing fun over the true fulfillment. So now, for example, like I'm kind of like I'm like de-arming myself from the life I had been living, right? Like I'm taking out like the casual drinking. I'm committing, doubling down on the things that I feel like will help me raise in terms of like who I want to be. Because my belief is that my queen will sort of come to me when I've done that work within, and not like by me just like swiping on Bumble or whatever, swiping left. So, thanks for listening. I just went on a massive, went off on a massive diatribe.
So I wonder with like something I've heard recently that I thought was really nice. I heard it before, but I heard it recently. I feel like I heard it even better. Was we can get filled up with knowledge, and then first there's like ignorance, and then knowledge, and you get the information and memorization, and you're like, it can appear as though a person has all these amazing stuff because they have these quotes and these studies and research, and like pretty much describing myself. And then from there you can go into a place of wisdom where you can assimilate that knowledge and you become lighter, and it just becomes like a part of your DNA. And you kind of let go and then drop those bags and just be, and you can kind of access these things at will. I wonder with experience with shamans, which is I think kind of like a charged word for some people listening, but people that you would consider to be like true shamans.
True teachers. Oftentimes they don't call themselves shamans.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe teachers or guides or anything like that, whatever word works for a person, but shamans.
Yeah.
Is there any unspeakable lessons that I'm saying, I guess you won't be able to speak it, but kind of like more wisdom-based lessons that were not necessarily something that you were told, but something that you felt?
Yes, 100%. And I think you actually draw, I don't know whether you intended to do this or not, but I think you draw one of the most profound distinctions that I think could be of greatest service to the audience, which is, in my humble experience, and I have what I have been very graced with, which is, I think a lot of life is about being in the listening, and what I've reckoned, and you and I have talked quite a bit about, because I think about, okay, what way can I be most of service? Is I have been graciously invited into some very unique contexts, ceremonies, rooms, so to speak, and those with whom I think I have felt the greatest wisdom are oftentimes the most humble. They do not dress the part. There's a gentleman who I'll speak of. I'll tell a quick story because it'll sort of bring this out a little bit more. But I actually had the very profound opportunity of sitting in sort of the Native American church style with a gentleman named Jerry, who was Diné Navajo. Large man, dressed. When I met him, trucker hat, t-shirt. Like he's not like, he's not trying to present any particular image, but he's a road man, which is what someone is called who's been serving peyote for over 30 years. And I describe it as like, say you're sitting next to Aretha Franklin on the bus, You know, you would have no idea that she was Aretha Franklin. But
Yep.
then if you saw her sing, you'd be like, what was that, right?
Yep.
I don't know if anyone listening has seen A River Runs Through It, but there's this scene at the end where Brad Pitt sort of has figured out this casting technique because he's put in his 20,000 hours on the fly fishing, and you know, it's sort of a peeking in, and like he's created his own technique, his own dance with the casting reel, such that he's in his mastery. He's created something beyond what has been done before. Jerry, sitting with him at sunrise, and I'm not going to betray anything of the ceremony, but seeing him with a rattle, and the rattle is oftentimes, as is the case with music, the mechanism through which we unlock the keys in our mind.
Yeah.
The way that he moved with that rattle, the way that he held himself and carried himself, calling everyone relatives, not prescribing, telling anyone how to live their life, by the way. There was no prescription, no declaration, no nothing. When he taught, if you even want to consider it taught, he taught in sharing stories.
Yeah.
And in those stories were anecdotes that one could find the answers they were looking for themselves. And I think what's powerful about, to me, the true master, quote unquote, shaman or the master plant, is they show you that you are the healer yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are providing you with a lighthouse in which narrative can be used to point you in the right direction. The people I'm wary of, which are frankly prolific in our technological age, are all the people that say that they have the magic pill. They've got the right solution. And in my humble experience, the people that I've found the most value in terms of their way of being, and you can feel it. It's like it's like you're sitting next to Aretha on the bus, like you just sense there's something special. Like with this guy, with Jerry, it was like when he started that talking and he'd say good morning relatives, and the stories he would share reminded me of this movie which I recommend anyone check out, called The Straight Story, where this gentleman, true story, takes his tractor, he finds out he has cancer, and he takes his tractor from Iowa to Michigan, 1,000 miles, to go see his brother who he hasn't talked to for 10 years. And it's just about a man reckoning with himself and his imperfect past. And along the way he meets people, inclusive of which is this young girl who's run away from home. I think she was pregnant or something, 15, 16. And he sits by the side of the road and he just offers her a safe haven for the evening. Doesn't tell her what to do, doesn't tell her this or that. He just provides the context through story in which she gets the answer she needs. And Jerry, to me, was sort of an exemplification of that, like that true elder that basically shared that story. And I think, to me, that is what it is. The shaman is the mechanism by which, the conduit through which the story is shared, such that you can receive the light in the way that is most profound and appropriate to your consciousness, and unlocks it in a way that you know what you need to do. Whether you choose to do it or not is up to you. But basically, to me, it's that unlocking of possibility and potential in a safe space where you can sort of be very clear on what the next step is in walking your walk. And I think if you have a plant medicine, which to me is a sacred technology, and a well-held orchestrator, which is a true shaman, there's very few technologies that provide that kind of context in modern day living that I think can give you that level of insight outside of that context. I mean, there are very powerful modalities, from breath work to meditation. I'm not to say you have to take an entheogenic medicine, but it is one of the most profound contexts for reckoning and realization in and when it's held by what I would call a true master.
Yeah, I'm with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we got to wrap this up, but I think that's everything that you just said is what my conscious mind is working to tap into, so that my conscious mind can kind of get out of the way.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of
Totally.
like I'm like actively navigating myself into that, so I can just let go and just be navigated.
Yeah.
So
you and me both, man.
Yeah. So where should people go from here? I appreciate you making time to get
Yeah, dude,
conversate.
it's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I will likely have conversations down the road, but if anyone wants to reach out, just hit me up. at Michael Trainer on the socials. Peak Mind with Michael Trainer is the podcast, which you're about to be on, and peakmind.org is my company.
Cool.
Yeah.
And on your podcast, you had like Gandhi and
not Gandhi that I know about, no, but I have had some. I've been fortunate to host some wonderful humans. Yeah.
Name drop a couple of people.
Well, I launched Peak Mind with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So Dalai Lama was the first episode. But everyone from sort of, which I think some of the folks you've had, the Mark Hymans, the Laird Hamilton, Maria Sharapova on that side, to the sort of Deepak Chopra, Dalai Lama. I did actually have Banky, the gentleman I just mentioned, that Brazilian shaman. Right. That was the first foreign language episode I've ever done. So it's translated from Portuguese. So it's probably for those who have a little bit more patience. But my intention actually moving forward is to do a lot more around finding these and revealing some of these true, where it's appropriate, because I think some of it's better kept secret, and for those who are ready and when they find them. But as I discover those who I think are desired to be shared, I'm going to share more of some of these other traditions through the podcast.
Thanks, awesome.
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Yeah.
All right, let's wrap this bitch up. On to the next one.
All right, you got it. Done.
I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. That was not on my typical audio equipment, which was one of the reasons I was hesitant to release it, but I thought the conversation was worth releasing, even though the audio was not up to my typical standard, but still good stuff. I'm sure you got a lot of goodness out of it. If you did, share it on the Instagram. It's a great place. You could get on top of your roof and shout to your local neighbors that specific parts that you'd like. Whatever makes you feel good, and is the most joyous way of sharing this conversation. I am in support of you doing that. Or just shut up about it and put it inside your noggin and put it to work and be the change that you are looking for. And I think that's a fine way too. I hope it inspired you, is what I'm trying to say. You can tag me at Align Podcast, ALIGN Podcast, or Mr. Michael Trainer on the Instagram as well. By or, I mean and. Tag both of us. Share that stuff around. We'll repost it. It's going to be a great experience. Thanks so much again for reviews on iTunes. Thanks for grabbing the Align Method book. Leaving reviews on that are awesome as well. And finally, if you'd like to learn some breathing practices to help calm your nervous system down or amp yourself up like you're drinking a cup of coffee, we break that down in the first free week of the Align Method online program. And that can be found at alignpodcast.com. It's also in the bio of the Align Podcast Instagram page. Reach out, say what's up. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation, and keep doing you. I will speak to you again in about 7 days. Thanks so much.